In this video, I'm going to discuss 11 hacks for baking soda in the garden. It's used for all kinds of things, and I'm going to explain which of these actually work and which ones don't. Here's a list of the things I'm going to cover. And to make it a little easier for you, I'm going to timestamp each one of these. That will allow you to jump ahead to the right one, and I'll put a list of all of these in the description with the appropriate times beside them. Before I get started, let's discuss what baking soda really is. Whenever you see hacks for the garden, always understand the product that you're trying to use. A lot of times that information will explain whether or not it could possibly work. So first of all, baking soda and baking powder are two different things. We're talking about the soda in this video. Now if you look at a package of baking soda, you'll see the name right on there, baking soda. If we just look at the initials, you see what this product is, BS. And in fact, that's the truth of many of these recommendations. But some of them do work. So let's sort through that. Baking soda is sodium bicarbonate. Sodium is a nutrient that plants need, but in very, very small amounts. Even at a low dosage, sodium is toxic to plants. What about the bicarbonate part? Well, that's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Plants don't really use the bicarbonate as a molecule. And in water, it breaks up pretty quickly into water and CO2. It really isn't doing anything for plants. When we take baking soda and dissolve it in water, it does form an alkaline solution with a pH of about 8.3. So number one, does baking soda kill insects? A lot of the recipes I found online had neem oil or horticultural oil, and they added some baking soda to that. So the oils themselves will kill insects. The baking soda here isn't doing anything. Now in solution it does become alkaline, and I guess if you sprayed that directly on some insects, it might help harm them. But spraying plants so insects don't go on them isn't going to work with baking soda, although it does work with the oil. There's really no evidence that I found that baking soda is good as an insecticide, and I don't think it will harm very many insects, especially in the dilute solutions that are recommended online. Does baking soda cure fungal diseases? Now, if you look online, people will tell you that baking soda will cure all types of fungal diseases. Anytime anyone suggests that a particular concoction cures all fungal diseases, you know they don't know what they're talking about. There are thousands of fungal diseases, and they behave quite differently. It's really rare to find any kind of fungicide that works on all of them. So let's have a look at a couple of specific ones. Powdery mildew and black spot on roses. There are claims that baking soda cures both of those, but that's not true. Baking soda does absolutely nothing to black spot on roses, but it does have an effect on powdery mildew, but it doesn't cure it. If you take baking soda and make it up into a solution and spray plant leaves, it prevents the fungal spores of powdery mildew from germinating, so they don't infect the leaf. It prevents the progression of the disease, but it doesn't kill the fungus, and it's not going to clear up the white fungus that's on your leaves. It only prevents it from getting worse. Now, baking soda is sodium bicarbonate, and the sodium is toxic to plants. Most of the scientific work in this area has been done with potassium bicarbonate. It's a very similar molecule, but potassium you might recognize as one of the main nutrients for plants. Even at higher concentrations, potassium isn't particularly toxic, so potassium bicarbonate is a much better choice. That's not the baking soda you buy in a grocery store. In both cases, they're much more effective if they're mixed with some oil. And this has become known as the Cornell formula. And I've written a blog post that goes into this in detail. If you want more information, have a look at that post. Now, what does it do to other types of fungus? I don't really know. You'd have to look up every one of those fungus and see if someone has tested baking soda on them. But the idea that it cures all fungal diseases, that's certainly a myth. But it may work on certain types. Number 3. Baking soda is a good product to use for cleaning the leaves of your houseplant. Well, baking soda is used for cleaning your hands or tools, and it probably can clean the leaves on your plants as well. But remember, sodium is toxic, and if you mix this with water, you get an alkali solution. It has a high pH of 8.3, and plants want to stay below that. For those reasons, I wouldn't recommend it for cleaning the leaves on your plants. The best thing to use is a cloth that's just been dampened with some water, and wipe the leaves down with that. Number 4, baking soda stops the smell in a compost pile. Now, this idea probably started because most people know that taking a box of baking soda and putting it into your fridge will take the aromas out of the fridge. Makes your fridge smell better. Before I look at compost piles, let's look at the fridge. How well does it really work? Baking soda actually does absorb certain types of acids. The rancid smell of butter is due to something called butyric acid. And because it's an acid, baking soda is an alkali, they will mix together, and so baking soda does take that out of the air. When the baking soda is in a box, there's very little surface area to interact with the air, so it's not a very effective way to take aromas out of the fridge. The best way to make this work is to spread it on a plate and put that in your fridge, but nobody does that. The other thing you should know is that it only takes out certain types of odors, only compounds that are acids. Most of the other odors in the fridge are not attracted to baking soda. So in a fridge, baking soda is not a very good product for removing odors. What about a compost pile? Well, if you took a lot of baking soda and spread it all over the compost pile, I guess it might reduce some odors a little bit. But there's a much better solution. Odors from a compost pile are usually due to liquids being in there or too much nitrogen. Adding some dried leaves works great for reducing the smell. Mixing the pile up a bit also reduces that smell because it distributes the nitrogen to other parts of the pile. If you want to learn more about making compost, have a look at my new book, Compost Science for Gardeners. So would I recommend baking soda on a compost pile? No, I wouldn't. Compost piles have very little odor if you make them correctly, and there's absolutely no reason to spread baking soda on. Baking soda increases bloom. Let's go back to some basic chemistry. What is baking soda? Well, it's sodium. Sodium is actually toxic to plants, and it has nothing to do with producing more blooms on a plant. If anything, it's going to harm your plant. The other half of it is bicarbonate. You now know that that is carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. Plants get those nutrients from the air and water. They have a good access to those. If air and water produce better blooms, all our plants would be covered in flower. There's nothing in sodium bicarbonate, baking soda, that would increase the bloom. I think people online are just getting things mixed up. For instance, one video I watched suggested that baking soda helps hydrangeas bloom better because they like an alkaline soil. And the picture showed one of those nice blue hydrangeas. Well, as it turns out, the blue hydrangeas are only blue in acidic soil. If we add a lot of sodium bicarbonate to this soil, which is alkaline, we'll make the soil alkaline. So if anything, those hydrangeas will go pink. They won't stay blue. Clearly the people making that video have no clue about pH or hydrangeas. They're just picking something out of the grocery shelf and trying to sell it to you as an amendment for plants. I can't see any way that sodium bicarbonate is going to make more bloom. Now, a small amount of it isn't going to change the pH of soil either. And you don't want to use a large amount because the sodium's toxic to plants. Number 6, baking soda will make tomatoes less acidic tasting. This is an example where there's a little bit of scientific truth that has been expanded into a story that's completely false. I think the claim stems from this fact. If we take an alkaline compound, like sodium bicarbonate, and we put it in soil, we should be able to change the pH so the soil is less acidic. If the soil is less acidic, then the tomatoes will be less acidic. It seems to be logical, but it's not based on real science. As I mentioned, putting a little bit of baking soda on soil is not going to change the pH of that soil. it's not going to become alkaline. The second part of the story is also false. The pH of the soil has very little to do with the acidity in tomatoes. The flavor of tomatoes is based on the environment and the genetics. Sun, temperature, and the cultivar. That's what's responsible for the acidity of a tomato, not the nutrients you put in the soil. Now, there's one third factor that many people aren't aware of. We talk about some tomatoes being acidic and others being sweeter. But in fact, when scientists measure the acidity in tomatoes, they're all pretty much the same. What happens is that some produce a little more sugar, and that masks the acidity of the tomatoes. So they taste less acidic to us, but the amount of acidity in that tomato is the same as in all the others. Number 7, baking soda kills weeds. You take a little bit of baking soda, you pour it on the weed, and the weed dies. Well, just a minute. One of the other myths was that baking soda is good for cleaning the leaves on plants. Can't be both, can it? So what happens if I put baking soda on my weed? Well, if you put enough on and you make it slightly wet, it is alkaline, so it probably will damage the plant. And remember, sodium will also tend to kill the plant. So this might work a little bit. The problem here is that baking soda is very soluble in water. As soon as you water the garden or it rains, it will dissolve, and that sodium goes throughout the soil profile. Now you're killing your good plants as well as the weed. And even worse than that, the sodium goes through the soil profile and ends up in rivers and lakes and pollutes those. Sodium pollution is a real problem. It's not very good for killing weeds. There's a good chance that sodium will harm your other plants, and it's a pollution problem. If you really want to use sodium to kill weeds, use sodium chloride, table salt. You have more sodium in an ounce of table salt than in an ounce of baking soda. Baking soda is actually a really poor choice for killing weeds with sodium. But I suggest you use neither of those because of the pollution problem. Number 8, baking soda is a good fertilizer. Again, we'll see how chemical knowledge is so valuable. Baking soda is sodium, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. None of those are important nutrients to put on our soil. How can baking soda be a good fertilizer? It can't. It has none of the nutrients plants need, except for sodium. And as I said, plants need that in really tiny amounts, and it's almost never deficient in soil. If anything, the sodium level is too high for plants. It's rarely too low. So baking soda is a terrible fertilizer. So what people do online is a lot of times they'll mix the baking soda with other things like Epsom salt. And now the Epsom salt does add some magnesium if your soil needs it, which is unlikely. But using baking soda either in a mixture or as a standalone fertilizer makes absolutely no sense. Number 9, does baking soda kill ants? Well, if you've ever taken baking soda and a little vinegar and mixed them together, what happens? Well, you get a violent reaction and all kinds of bubbles are created. Now, in our stomachs, we have acids, and if we take a lot of baking soda and put it down into our stomach, we'll get bubbles too. So the thinking goes something like this. Ants also have acid in their stomach. If they come and eat the baking soda, it'll make bubbles and they'll burst. They'll blow up. Well, that's really nonsense. First of all, did you know that adult ants don't actually eat solid things? They won't eat the baking soda. Now, they might collect some and take it back to their nest to feed the young, but they don't eat it themselves. I think this idea came about because you can take borax, and if you mix it with some sugar, ants will take that back to their nest, and borax is very toxic to them. Somehow people have got borax and baking soda mixed up, and they think, well, if we put baking soda out there, ants will come and get that too. After all, it's a white chemical, just like borax. If one works, why wouldn't the other work? Well, they're chemically very different. As far as I know, baking soda does nothing to ants. It's certainly not going to make them explode. Baking soda can be used to measure the pH of your soil. Now, this one is a little bit true, but let's go through and understand what really happened. If my soil is really acidic, and I put on some baking soda. The two react and form bubbles. It releases CO2. If I have soil that's alkaline and I put baking soda on, nothing happens. There's no acid there. So people have gotten the idea that if I take my soil and mix it with a bit of water, throw in some baking soda, you can tell whether your soil is acidic or alkaline. And that's sort of true. It will work in extreme cases. But if the pH is only slightly alkaline or slightly acidic, the reactions are the same. You don't see the bubbles. It only works if soil is really acidic. The second problem is, even if you knew whether it was acidic or alkaline, you don't know how acidic it is or how alkaline it is. There's a huge difference between being slightly acidic, like a pH 6.8, and very acidic, like a pH 5. Completely different environments. You have to know which of those is true, and you're not going to do that with baking soda. So this test might be kind of fun. The reaction is actually used in exploding volcanoes. One of these projects that younger kids do for school, that's the reaction that's usually going on. But as far as measuring the pH of your soil, pretty much useless. Number 11, baking soda is good for cleaning your hands and tools. Well, this one's partially true too, but there's more to the story. Your skin is slightly acidic, and it has oils on this that are protecting the skin. When we wash with baking soda, we remove those acids. We end up drying the skin. That's not good for our skin. So baking soda will clean your hands, but it's not a good option. The other problem I have with it is that if I was out in the garden for a couple hours, my hands were all dirty, and I came in the house to get baking soda, I wouldn't be married very long. I'd rather use soap and water out in the garden. Now, the Egyptians used baking soda for cleaning things way back. Around 3500 BCE is when they started using this material. So it's been around a long time. They also used it for making mummies. And maybe that explains why the mummy's skin is always so dry looking. Now, baking soda might clean tools all right, but don't use it on your hands. Soap is a much better product for that. So there you have it, 11 garden hacks for baking soda. Which ones actually work? Well, you can use it to stop some fungal diseases like powdery mildew. Other than that, it doesn't have a lot of uses in the garden. It will also kill weeds, but as I suggested, you don't want to put sodium in the environment, so that's not a good option. As far as the other claims go, they're all myths. The best thing you can do with baking soda is keep it in the kitchen and make more cookies. Now, if you'd like to learn more about garden myths, have a look at this video right here. Happy gardening.